As a Bible college student, I was interested to find out that there are different variations of the New Testament. What do you think about that?
A lot of Christians get upset when they hear that, but there are some differences between the earliest manuscripts. But when you look at these, they're mainly misspellings and errors and copying of small words, prepositions and numbers and things like that. There's no Christian belief that would be changed by these variations.
Not even remotely. Let's look at myth number 2.
There is no reliable evidence about who the authors actually were. It is pretty much agreed that they were not eyewitnesses. In fact, the Gospels were probably written 40 to 100 years after Jesus' death.
Jennings is simply echoing a popular myth. Some of the theologians of the Jesus Seminar have suggested that writers pretending to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John took a historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, and invented a genealogy and added historical references as time went by, thus improving the authenticity of their story. There is no evidence that the earliest manuscripts of the Bible were altered to be more historic. In fact, there is proof that little of the New Testament has been altered. If we look at the early manuscripts of the New Testament, we find that there are some differences between variant manuscripts. But these are mainly small words, prepositions, and numbers. In addition, most modern translations make note of these differences in the form of footnotes. In fact, you could take all of the variant readings of the most reliable New Testament manuscripts and fit them all on one page. There is no major Christian doctrine that would be affected or changed by these small differences. Therefore, even with minor textual variations in the older manuscripts, Christians can still view Scripture as inerrant and inspired of God. What of the charge that historical references and stories surrounding Jesus' life were added later on? The fact is that the Jews recorded exact historical references, the best of all the ancient historians, because they believed that God was trying to teach them something through history. In keeping with this tradition, the writers of the Gospels sought to record accurate historical events surrounding the life of Christ. In Luke chapter 2, verse 1, we see that Jesus was born in the days of Cyrenius, the governor of Syria, and when Caesar Augustus was emperor. In Luke 3, chapter 1, we are given the exact year of the beginning of Jesus' ministry.
Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene.
These were the rulers of the surrounding countries of Judea in the 1st century. These are all true persons and places that may be corroborated in other recorded histories.
So, Joel, what about this idea that the Gospels were written many years after Christ?
Well, these higher critics face a huge problem here because in dating the New Testament in the 2nd century rather than the 1st, they just ignore the fact that there was a number of late 1st and 2nd century writers who quoted from the New Testament shortly after it was written.
So, Joel, there are people who knew the apostles, and there are people who knew other people who knew the apostles that wrote books in the 1st and 2nd century?
Exactly, and these early Christian writers quoted extensively from the New Testament.
We have already seen that Christian writers named Clement of Rome, the writer of the Epistle of Barnabas, and Polycarp wrote about Jesus in the 1st century. The Didache, a 1st century catechism, quotes extensively from the New Testament. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, quotes from 16 New Testament books. Irenaeus, the 2nd century bishop of Lyons, makes 1,819 references to New Testament scriptures. Tertullian quotes from the New Testament 7,258 times. The problem for the higher critics and those searching for a historical Jesus is that these people were writing in the late 1st and 2nd centuries. Since they quote from the New Testament books extensively, we can know that the church in many areas of the Roman Empire had access to all of the New Testament scriptures. So the Gospels must have been written sometime in the 1st century, during the time of the apostles. William Foxwell Albright, one of the world's foremost biblical archaeologists, said, In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and 80s of the first century, very probably sometime between AD 50 to 75. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there have been thousands of archaeological discoveries of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that are hundreds of years older than the manuscripts available prior to modern times. There are now more than 5,300 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and 24,000 manuscript portions available for study. In other words, there are more reliable New Testament manuscripts in the original Greek language available for direct translation into modern English today than ever before. Sir Francis Kenyon, who was the director and principal librarian of the British Museum, states, "The last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established."
So even at the end of the first century, the Christians who were around at that time already thought of what we know today as the New Testament as being Holy Scripture?
Definitely.
Wow.